Okay, so if you weren't with us last week, we made our way through Ruth chapter 1, and I'm going to give us some recap because I think it's important. So maybe you recall we started with some context stuff that really set the scene for the book. I won't review it all, but I do want to point out the things that were helpful in setting this up. So remember, this is a story of one family in the middle of the age of the judges. And so, if you recall, Judges is this time in Israel's history, as we remember from Judges 21, where there was no king, and it said that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And so, a very tough culture to live in. And this is a snapshot of one family who is living in that age, and that is the family of Ruth, or the family of Naomi and Elimelech. And so it's important for us to remember that context. Also, remember that this book is a narrative in its genre, and it is known to be the classic love story of the Bible. And it really is a beautiful story. And so, since it's a narrative, we are going to treat it that way in our study. And so, we are going to walk through it, as we did last week, walk through it as a story, reading it like we would a story. And what I want to do is pull in some of these outside sources to provide for you a full picture of the story so we can hear it with the beauty that it is. And so, it obviously looks different than like a letter, like we did in Ephesians, or the way we might tackle another book, because this is a story. And so also something that's important is that this book brings women's perspectives. It's wrote from a woman's perspective. Might be a better way to put that. In that the writer gives attention to feminine values and feminine perspectives the way you might not see in another book of the Bible. For example, Naomi in last week, Naomi was describing her state after losing her husband and her two children, and she described herself as hopeless because in that day and age, your value was tied to your husband and to your offspring. And so when she lost those things, she said, "I have nothing." And so this is a perspective we get from a woman's angle that you may not get in another book. For example, if it's a man, he would just remarry and create a legacy for himself. But that was not the case in Naomi's story. And so I'm going to continue to try to point those out for us when we see them here. And so also we said some things to be looking for. And so I've separated them into primary and secondary themes. And so I'm not going to unpack them here because I don't want to ruin the story, but we see this theme of redemption throughout the entire book of Ruth. You see, really, I'd say that's the basis of this story. We see bold faith. Think about Ruth saying, "Your God will be my God. I will go where you go. I will die where you die." Kindness. We're going to see that today explode. We're going to see this side, and not just kindness, not just like, hey, be kind to one another, but deep, deep sacrificial kindness. And then some secondary things we see as well. The sovereignty of God, just that God is in control of all things. We see God giving purpose to our pain, which is, I know we hit that in our God and Suffering series, but it's really reiterated here in Ruth. And then, as we'll see primarily towards the end of this book, the diversity and the equality of God's people. We see God's people not just single ethnic, but it is all people. And that is a beautiful thing. And so those are some of the themes we will see here. But I wanted to also point out that I believe that there is one key theme that I think is reiterated in every session that we go through here in Ruth. And that is this, that God takes ordinary people from despair to delight. He takes us from despair to delight. And I think we will see that today. I think we saw a glimpse of it last week, and we will continue to see it. And so that was the groundwork we laid last week. And then we went through chapter 1. And so I want to provide some recap there. And so when we walked through chapter 1, we saw that a famine had hit the land of Bethlehem. And making life in the period of the judges, which remember had no king and really no ethic, it made it much harder considering now there's no food. Okay, so this is the situation that this family finds themselves in. And so we tracked Elimelech and his family, his wife Naomi and their two sons, as he leads them away from the promised land, away from Bethlehem, and into Moab. And this Moab, we saw, was really a corrupt land that was birthed from sin, that was an enemy land of the people of God, but led them there really in search of a brighter future. And it makes sense. I mean, considering what he was leaving in the tough situation, it's understandable. Anyway, while they're there, Elimelech dies. While they're there, the children marry two Moabite women, and soon after that, the two sons die, to where Naomi is left with just two Moabite daughters-in-law, and we see in her basically a Job-like tragedy, where she is left with nothing. And so Naomi, with Naomi, with only her two sons, they locked it. Naomi, with her two Moabite daughters-in-law, they hear that the Lord has brought food back to Bethlehem, and they said, okay, let's head back. And so on their way, though, what we hear is we hear Naomi really turn to them and say, ladies, go back to your home. Like, I recognize my future is bleak. Don't tie your lot to mine. Go on back. Be cared for by your mother and your father. Don't keep following me. I'm flattered. I love you, but go and find a better future back in your homeland. And so we said that was really sacrificial kindness on display. She was willing to give up these relationships for the sake of their future. And so one of her daughters-in-law, Orpah, says, okay, heads back, but Ruth, in the famous line, decides to stay with her. And that was that display of bold faith, where she says, look, for where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. And so she makes this bold claim of faith and says, no, I'm coming with you. And so they set out to Bethlehem together. And when they arrive, we see that the ladies of the town are like, hey, is this Naomi? Like, it's been 10 years. Can you believe it's her? But things look much different, right? She left with her husband. She left with her two sons. She left really with hope, with support. And she returns only with one Moabite woman. And she responded to these women with honest faith. She says, look at what God has done to me. Look at how the Almighty has stuck out his hand against me. And so we pointed out how it was a bitter faith that Naomi had, but it was faith nonetheless. She was willing to say, look what the Lord has done to me. She didn't write off her faith. She didn't give herself to the faith of the Moabites. She said, no, look what the Lord has done to me. And so we reminded ourselves that even a bitter faith is something that the Lord can restore. Even a faith that's hardened can be used by God. And we see that in the fact that Naomi, because of her faith in the Lord, God draws her back to Bethlehem, hearing that there is now food there. And when she's there, God sets the scene for redemption. Because it is there that we see that she comes back with two needs. And that is, she had a need for food. She wanted to live. She had a need for family, if they wanted to have any lasting impact there, a legacy. And so little do they know, they are returning during, as verse 22 said at the end of chapter 1, during barley harvest. And it is in the barley harvest and in the setting of these barley fields that we see God begin to lay out the path for redemption for Ruth and Naomi. And so that's where we're picking up in the story, is Ruth chapter 2. Any thoughts or questions there? I feel like I just gave like a previously on Ruth, like from Netflix. Okay, so Ruth chapter 2. Now, we're about to read what I believe could be the best day that Naomi and Ruth have had in a very long time. Ruth chapter 2. And I encourage you, follow along in your Bible here. I will stop us when I need to. But we're just going to be, I don't have them up here on the slides. We're just going to be walking through the word here. So, verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Okay, so before the story even starts, I want to pause us because it's like the author provides some foreshadowing here. It's like we hear the author's voice over the story here as he introduces this character, Boaz. And so here's what the author wants us to see about Boaz. It says, one, Boaz is related to Elimelech. Okay, so he is which is Naomi's deceased husband. So he says we have someone who's related to Elimelech. It also, we see that Boaz is a worthy man. And some indicate this could be like a financial statement, like he is wealthy, but more likely it's speaking of his character. So Boaz is a man of conviction, an honorable man, someone who is worthy of praise. So that's what we hear about Boaz. We also see he is in the clan of Elimelech. Okay, so the clan was the single most important social or family group in Israelite society. Okay, so a clan consisted of various families descended from a common ancestor. So just think about it like this. An individual was a part of a family was a part of a clan was a part of a tribe. And within clans, there were certain obligations and responsibilities to care for one another. And so here we learn, and all we really need to see here, is that there were certain opportunities within a clan to help one another. And so we're learning here that that Boaz is in the same clan as Elimelech. So, considering Boaz's relation to Elimelech, considering his responsibility as a member of their clan, and his honorable character, could it be that Boaz would be of some help to Ruth and Naomi where they're at? I think the author's trying to give us this little insight here before the story even begins. So, then we continue. Verse 2. And Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." Okay, pause again. So Ruth approaches Naomi and says, "Hey, let me go to the field and let me glean among the ears of grain." And what she is saying really is warranted. God has set up a way for the poor and needy to be cared for during harvest time. This is in God's law. He says this is how we're going to care for the poor and needy. Now, there's a passage here, Leviticus 23, which is part of the law, in which God really ordains this care. This is how it goes. It says that when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, nor shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. Okay, now it wasn't an abundance, but it was something. God had mandated a way for the poor and needy to be cared for by requiring landowners to really leave some behind for them to go and pick up. Okay? And so seeing that she and Naomi were certainly poor and needy, she says, "Hey, let me go and glean and see if I have any luck getting food." So she is warranted in doing so. And she also says, "Hey, while I'm there, maybe someone will like me and find interest in me and have pity on our situation." So she says, maybe someone will have favor on me. Now, this is a stretch, though, and the author reminds us that Ruth is a Moabite, an enemy of the land. And so when you think about the poor and the sojourner and how they would be dependent on the generosity of a landowner, you have to also understand that there would be a hierarchy in who gets the gleanings, right? So think about that. If there's stuff on the ground, there you as any society will do, they generally tend to hierarchies. And so certainly the Israelite poor men and women would have first dibs. They'd be able to walk through and get what they needed. Then the foreign male would have the opportunity to go and glean. Then likely the non-violent sojourner. So maybe a neighboring country that was at least cordial with the people of God. Then the enemy Moabites would have their pass. So you can imagine there would be nothing left unless it was for the utter generosity and abundance of a landowner. Nevertheless, Naomi agrees and she sends Ruth on her way. Okay, so that's the situation. She's saying, "Hey, I'm going to go." It's like, "Hey, give it a shot." All right, let's see what happens next. Verse 3. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. Okay, so look what the author has said here. It says she happens to come. She happens to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. It just so happens. You wouldn't believe it, but she comes upon Boaz's field. And so really the author creates this drama in the language that they use. Ruth sets out looking for food, hoping that someone would see her, would find favor in her, and wouldn't you know it, she stumbles upon the field of Boaz. And wouldn't you know it, Boaz is a clan member with Elimelech. And it is here that I think we see the second occurrence in our themes of God's sovereignty, right? God's divine convergences is what we called it. Last week we saw that God drew Naomi and Ruth back to Bethlehem at the same time as barley harvest. And then within that opportunity, God sends Ruth out to glean and happens to come to the field of Boaz. So we see these divine convergences. And so this, I would say, some might call coincidence. I think that would be, I guess, the general term for it. But as Christians, I believe we believe in a powerful, sovereign God that does all things, listen to this, with order and with divine intentionality. With order and divine intentionality. And I think what this story for me, as I have been preparing this, has already compelled me to be open to these types of convergences in my life. To be willing to think about life through that lens. I think we need to be reminded that God has a purpose for each of my days. God has a purpose for each of my days. Not necessarily that He wants me to do something great each day or that blessings are coming my way. More like God desires me to see my life as more than just cogs in a wheel working together, moving along the day. But instead, see that God may be orchestrating in my life situations and in the people that I interact with. He might use those for my good or for the good of others. Now, honestly, I think one of the challenges with this, and I would say it's in our current age, is that we have become accustomed to being Christians by name, but atheists by function. Okay, and what I mean by that is we call ourselves Christians. We have a tendency to say that we live under the rule of God, but it is not abnormal for us to live as if He's not there. It is not abnormal for us to go about our day without considering how He might be orchestrating our days. Christians by name, atheists by function. And so maybe more likely to live as if He is there when I need it or to blame whenever things go wrong. This is atheism by function. Now, it's hard to say if this is primarily a product of American culture or of American Christianity, though it's likely a mixture of both. But the reality is that most of us live with very little intentional thoughts around why God orchestrates our days the way that He does. Now, hear me. I'm not saying that we should be looking into every person or every opportunity and looking for some sort of spiritual means. I'm not saying that because that could be exhausting. But what I am doing is using Ruth's story to challenge our tendency to succumb to functional atheism. Challenging through Ruth's story to remind us that God does orchestrate divine convergences every day. And I'm thinking, I try to think through some examples, but you can insert yours the way that you would like. You're here, getting coffee, working on schoolwork. God, is there anyone I need to be aware of here? Those types of questions, those types of thoughts. I just got a raise. God, is there someone in need that you want me to direct a part of this to? Or, hey, this person's walking through a really challenging time. Lord, how might you have me step in and fill this need? Where we begin to think about these circumstances we find ourselves in and asking the Lord, Lord, are you asking me to respond and see that you're working in these things? These are divine convergences. Now, it is not uncommon to become oblivious to this, I think, and I think we will default to that. So I want to talk about it. On a daily basis, what blinds us or makes us indifferent, you would say, to divine convergences? What do you think? Mm-hmm. Monica?
The hustle and bustle of the American way,
Yep.
and also the real reality of just from the moment you open your eyes to the moment you close your eyes, having way more on your plate than you're even really able to handle.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Which is why I think it is a product of not just American Christianity, but American culture. Like I think that's the pace in which we live at. And so it's almost like if I do open my eyes to that, where does my attention goes off of the things that I perceive that I need to pay attention to? What do you think?
Piggybacking off of that, sometimes it's like expectations. So it's like, just simple example, I'm driving down the road, I see someone like broke down on the side of the road, and it pops in my mind like, hey, maybe God wants me to go and help them. But I'm like, yeah, but then I'll be late for work. I can't be late for work.
Sure.
I'll get in trouble if I'm late for work.
Yeah.
So I don't have time for that, God.
Yeah.
So then you just keep on going.
That's right. That's good.
Social media.
Sure. Expand on that.
It definitely is a very powerful subliminal entity in that you end up you can end up sort of going down a whole rabbit hole.
Sure.
That veers you off the course of what you know you need to do for you, yourself, your family, your life.
Yeah.
You end up thinking that perhaps another way, which is not really what you know deep down, is your way, and it's very influential.
Sure, that's great. I would add this is external influences. I would say pressures. What else?
Maybe it takes place in the confines of a seemingly normal routine.
Sure.
As an example, like at work, you might see a coworker, and that might be a divine convergence because, hey, that surgery got done at this time, this surgery got this done at this time, which is like pretty incredible. They will walk the same path, cross the same path, so it's divine convergence, but you think it's in the confines of the
Sure.
typically.
Yeah. Sure. That's right.
I don't think I ever take the time to be still or quiet and then to even notice the Lord speaking to me.
Yeah.
Like if I'm driving in the car, I have the radio on, or if I'm cleaning at the house, I have a podcast in. Like I'm never quiet, just in my thoughts.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
I'll throw one more out there.
Sure.
Awkwardness.
Oh yeah.
I think sometimes is the thing that's like laundry mat. If there's a person is like, I could say hey to them. I could see if the conversation sparks and God wants to use that. But that might be awkward. It's like
Sure.
usually a stranger that's just randomly talking to me, and so
Yeah.
it's kind of like something like,
Yeah.
oh my God, that might be weird.
So Nick, what we're discussing is we've talked about how in Ruth's story we see these divine convergences. Ruth has a need. God is miraculously meeting that need through another person's story. And so we're talking about on a daily basis what blinds us or makes us indifferent to those types of divine convergences that we may just overlook. So to kind of get you up to speed.
I was sitting by the door.
Oh, great. Okay.
And I couldn't hear the people over here.
Yeah. Okay.
I think something for me is remembrance of messing up in the past.
Oh, sure.
And just
Yeah, that's a good point.
I guess down.
Yep. Anything else? I think the hustle and bustle that's a big one. I think we are enculturated into that. And so again, what I am not saying, as I mentioned, I'm not saying look into everything that happens. But what I am saying is just be willing to, I would say, be still and reflective sometimes and say, Lord, is there something that you're wanting me to do here? Is there a way that you're wanting me to respond? Just so that we might be open to those types of interactions. Divine convergences. Anything before we keep moving?
Just one more that popped in my mind is sometimes there's like I guess it would be fear, but it's like if you've been burned in the past by opening yourself up and trying to like take advantage, say like, hey, I feel like I got this opportunity, I'm gonna do this.
Yeah.
Then you can like put blinders on yourself because you're upset and you don't want to experience that again. And you're like, you know what? Like,
Yep.
what's the point?
Yep. Yeah. For sure. All right, let's keep moving here in their story. We're in verse 4. And so Ruth is there in the field of Boaz, and then we start verse 4. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. And as I thought about that, I was like, wouldn't it be crazy if our work day started that way? Like, you're sitting there and your boss comes in, the Lord be with you, and everyone stands up and also with you. Wouldn't that be nice? But anyways, verse 5. Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, she is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Okay, a few things worth pointing out. Notice what Boaz says. Whose young woman is this? Whose young woman is this? First of all, here's our female perspective. He doesn't ask, who is that? He says, who is she? Who does she belong to? Right? Her identity, and I want you to feel this. I want you to feel this. There you go. Her identity is completely tied to who she is married to and who she belongs to. That is a scary place to be. It is a very vulnerable place to be. You are physically, financially, and mentally dependent on another. That is your life. In a vulnerable place that makes a desperate woman very easy to take advantage of. And I want you to think about what Boaz could have done knowing how desperate Ruth was, right? However, Boaz asked this question with compassion. So think about the vulnerability of Ruth. He knows her backstory now. He knows where she's been. He knows she has nothing. And he has the opportunity, if he wants to leverage his power and take advantage of this woman. But what does he do? He says, who does Ruth belong to? And not in the sense that we might think, but he is saying, who is responsible to care for her? Who loves her? Who is here to help her? And this is the question he asks his foreman, to which the foreman tells her story. She is the Moabite woman that came back with Naomi. She asked to glean here, and I said yes. Okay? So watch how Boaz responds. He goes and pursues Ruth, and then watch here, verse 8. He says, then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter. Now I want you to think, he says, listen. And Ruth could have been anticipating a number of ways that he could have finished that sentence. He could have said, listen, take what you need and go. Don't come back here. He could have said, listen, go back to your land where you belong. You are not welcome here. He could have said, listen, you can stay here, but it's going to cost you. Boaz could have responded in so many different ways, but what does he say? He says, listen, daughter. And I'm just imagining how this term of endearment would have flooded Ruth with peace. He's watching her approach. He's like, what's he going to think of this? I know who I am. I'm a Moabite woman. I know who he is. He could respond however he wants. How is he going to respond? And he says, listen, daughter. And it's at that moment where I think she eases herself. Okay, look how he continues. My daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. Okay, so look at what he does. He says, first, daughter. And then he's going to do some things for her. He says, don't worry about looking for other lands to glean in. No, he says, stay here. I will provide for you. I will provide for you. Not only that, he says, let me protect you. It was common for the workers to abuse the gleaners, and specifically the women, the female gleaners. It was common for them to be mistreated. That's all right. See ya. Oh, I think she'll go to her mom. No, you're all good. He says, let me protect you. And so Boaz says, look, don't worry about them harming you. I've told them not to touch you. You will be safe in my field. So again, continue to put yourself in her shoes. What is she feeling? Daughter, I'll provide for you. I'll protect you. Right? He doesn't stop there. He says to this foreign, poor woman, let me serve you. He says, when you're thirsty, go to the well and drink what the men have drawn. So this is absurd. This is a culture where women draw water for men. Not only that, this is where foreigners draw water for Israelites. But here we see Ruth, a Moabite woman, is about to drink water drawn by Israelite men. Boaz finds this helpless and hopeless woman and says, my daughter, let me provide for you. Let me protect you. Let me serve you. And can you feel what she must be feeling there? Amazed by his kindness. What in the world has Ruth done to deserve this type of kindness? Well, it seems that Ruth kind of feels the weight of that she understands she is unworthy. Look at verse 10. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner? But Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. And so Boaz says, look, I know your story. I know it is an amazing story of faith and sacrifice. And then he blesses her. Look at verse 12. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. So again, I want you to hear that. I want you to hear how she responds to him and says, look, you have comforted me. You've spoken kindly to me. Boaz could have responded so differently. And she says, look, you've comforted me. But this amazing day for Ruth is not over. Look, keep reading. Verse 14. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers And he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. So think about this. What a radically different picture that this looks like compared to what she expected when she set out. That morning, she was saying, can I just get enough scraps for us to eat? Not just for me, but could I somehow come home with enough for Naomi as well? Her bar was very low. But look at how this day has ended, where she's ending with a wealthy man not only providing for her, but inviting her to come and eat her fill beside Israelite men and women. And for me, when I think about as someone who just loves to eat, like I love when there is not just enough food on the table, but there is enough for me to take home. And there to be satisfied to your fill and more is a glorious day. It reminds me of our time at the Dentons when you sent us home with that pasta that was glorious. So good, I almost ate it for breakfast. And so it is likely that Ruth was not accustomed to abundance. She was not used to excess. She was not accustomed to that. But she experiences it here in Boaz. And look, if he hasn't done enough for her, he continues. Verse 15. When she rose to glean, so she's singing, she's about to head back to the field. Verse 15. Boaz instructed his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. He says, look, don't just leave scraps for her, leave bundles behind. So essentially, don't even make her work for it. Pull out a bunch, set it to the side, let her pick it up. He is completely changing her expectations. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Okay, so an ephah was about 1 bushel. I'm sure that helps a lot, right? And a bushel was a lot. It was about 10 days worth of food. Okay, so this was what she managed in one day. She leaves searching for scraps, and instead receives enough food for 10 days in the first day that she's there. And so if you think about how this day started, and not just how her day started, but likely what her life has been like for a while now. Poor, mistreated, uncertain, wandering, suffering, hopeless. But this day, where Ruth was seen and valued, where she was protected and provided for, where she was served, Ruth felt a glimmer of hope. Likely a feeling that she had given up on. Wouldn't you think? Likely a feeling she had given up on. All was lost, but in steps Boaz. That is the script for a Lifetime movie. Right? I mean, you think about how beautiful this is. How she had nothing, and this hero comes and lavishes upon her these things. So, this is kind of comical. Ruth heads home with her 10 days worth of food on her back or in her cart, however she carries this. And I'm just trying to imagine Naomi's face when she sees Ruth rolling in with this, what she has gathered today. Verse 18. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. And she also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And so she shows up and she's got all this barley. And on top of that, she pulls out a to-go box from lunch and says, hey, this is yours too. I'm imagining Naomi is baffled by this. Baffled by this. In fact, I think we see that. Verse 19. And her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? So she's thinking, what location has this much excess? Like, where are you finding this on the ground? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. And so I'm just imagining Ruth is on top of the world as she's telling her mother-in-law about her day. She's beaming. She's probably having a hard time believing that it's true. And then Naomi says, where have you been? Who has shown you this favor? Who has given this to you? I want you to notice this. Naomi doesn't know where she has been, and Ruth is still not aware of Boaz's relation to her. Right? That first bit there at the beginning was just narration for us to know. Nobody knows that Boaz is involved, or at least knows the significance of it. And so Ruth responds, middle of verse 19. So she told her mother-in-law, with whom she had worked, and said, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. And upon hearing the name of Boaz, Naomi feels hope. Hearing the name of Boaz, Naomi feels hope. The past 10 years of her life have been marked by tragedy, have been marked by utter destruction, depression, sadness. And some of you know how tragedy has a tendency to crush hope. Some of you know that tragedy, when it hits, it has a tendency to crush hope for the future. And so it is likely, upon hearing this man's name and seeing this expression of kindness that he bestowed upon Ruth, that a sense of hope is restored in her that she hasn't experienced for a long time. And so look at how she responds. Verse 20. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord. And this word, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi also said to her, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. Verse 21. And Ruth the Moabite said, besides, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest. Okay, so Ruth says, look, this wasn't just one lucky day. He said, I can keep coming back until the harvest is over. Like, this isn't just today. I think we can keep getting this. And so Naomi is floored. You can imagine what they might be feeling here. I want us to look at the word that she used to describe the works of Boaz. Verse 20. And I think you should circle this word kindness. Does anyone have another translation that's not ESV? Anybody? What does that word kindness say there?
May the Lord bless him, Naomi, her daughter-in-law. He is showing his kindness to us as well as to your dead husband.
Okay.
That man is one of our closest relatives, one of our family redeemers.
Okay. So kindness there again. What do you have, Ben?
NIV was kindness. NLT is kindness. So there's a lot of kindness.
Okay. General consensus is kindness. Great. So kindness is a decent word here that our English language is really doing its best to describe what's going on here. But really, there is not an English word that adequately describes the Hebrew word that's here. This Hebrew word is hesed. Some say he said. I say hesed. And so a Hebrew reader in this context would have understood this word, hesed, to be love, loyalty, sacrifice, faithfulness, provision, mercy, and compassion, all wrapped up into one word. Right? So this word, kindness, to us means one thing. To a Hebrew reader, that word, is that Mali? I think that's Mali. It's okay. That word, to a Hebrew reader, would be something totally different than what we even have the words to articulate with. To a Hebrew reader, Boaz would not have been understood just as a kind man. Boaz would have been seen as someone who opened the floodgates of love and compassion on an unworthy individual. His radical acts of kindness to a foreigner would have been breathtaking and would leave someone speechless. This is the kindness that Boaz embodies to Ruth. And we cannot read about this kindness, hesed, without being drawn to consider the hesed love of God towards us. Listen to this. Like Ruth, with an empty heart and with an empty hand coming to this field, coming to Boaz, so do we bring nothing but sin to Jesus. As Boaz surveyed the field and he saw Ruth, Jesus surveyed the world and found value in you. As Boaz sought out Ruth, knowing her story, seeking her out, Jesus pursued us. As Boaz, listen to this, went beyond the law, went beyond what was required of him to provide, Jesus goes beyond the law and offers grace to us. Like Ruth, we are in need of grace, and Jesus, the glorious Boaz, is pleased to offer it to us. This theme, again, as Boaz offered to Ruth, God offers to save us from despair and bring us into delight as He showers us with Hesed love, a Hesed kindness. And so you might be thinking, I think this is important to ask. Why are we talking about Jesus when we're really talking about Ruth and Boaz? Why would Jesus even come up in this situation? This is what I want us to become trained to see. I want us to become trained to read the Bible in this way. The entire Bible points to God's love for you and for me. The entire Bible points to His hope and His purpose for us. And the stories we read in the Bible are not just a collection of stories meant to be beautiful and true in their time. But they are not just meant to be enjoyable and informative to us. It is the stories and life accounts in the Old Testament that we follow the redemptive thread of God's love throughout the entirety of Scripture. And where we see that the Bible tells the story of God's redemptive heart that has been present from the beginning of time, that has been constant throughout history, that culminates in the person and the work of Jesus, and that extends for eternity into the kingdom of God. The entire Bible points us to God's heart for us, and this proof of His heart is wrapped up and it is fulfilled in the person and work of Jesus. And it is reading the Bible with this redemptive framework, with this understanding that God is trying to get us to look to Jesus, look to His redemption, that we begin to read the Bible completely different. Because when we read the Bible this way, we see that Jesus is the true and better Adam, who, when faced with temptation, did not give in as Adam did, but instead persevered on our behalf. When we read the Bible this way, we see that Jesus is the true and better Noah, whose faithful work would not just endure a worldwide flood, but would endure the wrath of God on sin. Jesus is the true and better Moses, whose bold faith and leadership would not just lead God's people from bondage into the promised land through a part in the Red Sea, but he would lead us from the bondage of sin into new life in Him. And you can go on and on and on. And here we see that Jesus is our glorious Boaz, who saw us in our helpless state with nothing to offer and extends His hand and says, "Let me draw from you and clothe you with the righteousness that I have and let you rest in the riches of my grace." This is the true and glorious Boaz, better found in Jesus. This is how we read the Bible. We point ourselves to Jesus and we see it in the stories of the Bible. This is the glorious reality of God's love. And so the question that we need to chew on is, will you rest in it? A Hesed love. A love that says, I have found you. I have given you more than what you deserve. I've seen you as a foreigner and redeemed you. Will you enjoy it? And so I want us to discuss this briefly. What obstacles do you face in resting in the Hesed love of God towards you? That's right. Yeah.
Say like selfish desire. So like if the desires I have for this world and the things I gain in this world are greater than my desire to experience the love of God, then I won't be satisfied. But I won't be satisfied either way.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
the only way to find that satisfaction is in the essence love of God. So
Right.
even if you try to find in the world, you ain't getting it then.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
That's right.
Feeling of inadequacy, not worthy,
Sure.
not worthy the rest of the love that I'm worthy to have.
Yep. Which is the beauty of Hesed love as we see in this story. Ruth had absolutely no reason to get what Boaz gave her. And it wasn't just like, here's some food. It was lavishly bestowed upon her. That is the beauty of Hesed love. It is kindness poured out despite not deserving any of it. What else? Anything? What went through my mind is we can sometimes be convinced that God rewards when we are faithful. And in the alternative to that is God withholds when we are not. That when we don't hold our end of the bargain, we are punished. I think we certainly can fall into that. I would encourage you to take time to wrestle with this, because ultimately this is something that Jesus invites us to. He says, "Come and find rest in me." He says, "Find that my yoke is easy." And so why do we feel burdened sometimes when we're following Jesus? He says, "Come and find rest." And so I think what we have to wrestle with is, how do we rest in, enjoy, let our identity be marked by the love that God has bestowed upon us despite our not deserving it. There's a lot, and I will just make a reference to it. There's a lot of resources out there that help us see, and maybe we can unpack them sometime, about really understanding our union with Christ and how that doesn't just shape us upon salvation, but that is really the truth that we remind ourselves over and over and over again throughout our life. We remind ourselves not how faithful have I been, we remind ourselves, who am I in Jesus? That is the verdict. And that is how we embrace this Hesed love. Anything else before we move on here? We're almost done. Okay, we're going to finish this up, and we'll be setting the stage here as we finish up, really for the next session too. Verse 22. So Ruth has just said that Boaz offered for her to stay in the field throughout the whole season. So that's where we pick up at. And here is Naomi's response. Verse 22. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So again, that's just a reminder that that's at least a fear you would have as a woman in that environment. Verse 23, so she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest. And she lived with her mother-in-law. Okay, so verse 23, I think that gives us a summary for what the next 6 to 7 weeks would have looked like for them. Ruth gleaning in Boaz's field, lacking nothing, and Ruth and Naomi living together. And I think if this was a movie, this was when you would see this montage with maybe some cool music in the background, a montage of some of these things happening, like Ruth bringing home barley in her cart every day, look at this, and Naomi's just baffled every time, and it shows them loading it in their storage room and just unbelieving what God has done, and then maybe some Ruth and Boaz interactions, and then you probably see them at the table smiling to one another, maybe something they haven't done in a long time. Now, this certainly is a happy part of the story, but there's still tension here. Okay, and I want to point this out to you. Not all is resolved. There's still tension. Remember, they came back to Bethlehem with 2 needs. Do you remember what the needs were? Food and family. So one of their needs is being met, food, but just for now, right? Is this just for the season, or will extend to next year? What if Boaz passes away, or what if Boaz changes his mind? Like that, there goes my food. So one of their needs is being met, but really just temporarily. But also, what about their family? I mean, Ruth and Naomi are still living together. It's not like Boaz has pursued them. And so really their need of family is not met yet. And so though it's a happy time in the story, there's still tension. However, Ruth makes a really important statement back in verse 20. Naomi also said to her, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. He's one of our redeemers. Naomi says, hey, he can help us. He's a redeemer. I think we have a shot. And so let me show you what he's referring to. Birthed in the redeeming heart of God, God placed in His law a visual representation of His redemption by allowing property and people to be redeemed after they are lost. In His law, He created a system for this to happen. Here it is, Leviticus 25. Verse 47, it says, if a stranger or sojourner, so this is from God's law, if a stranger or sojourner with you becomes rich, and your brother beside him becomes poor, and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner with you or to a member of the stranger's clan, then after he is sold, he may be redeemed. He may be brought back. And by who? One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle or his cousin may redeem him, or a close relative from his clan may redeem him. Or if he grows rich, he may redeem himself. Okay, so you see that there is a path of redemption. Now, this was for a man, though. For a man. This was certainly easier than that of a woman. Okay, because unfortunately, women were often not seen with intrinsic value. Their value was something they had to earn by having children, or something they had to inherit by the husbands that they would marry. So for a man, being redeemed was one thing, because someone would redeem you and say, hey, you're going to go make something of yourself. But for a woman, there was not much profit in redeeming a poor woman. And so nevertheless, Naomi points out that there is hope. He is at least a close relative from our clan. And so could it be that Boaz's kindness extends past the barley field and he'd be willing to redeem? Is that our hope? Is that something we can count on? And so I want to set the scene here for the next session. We see the tides turning. We see an opportunity for hope, but still in that tension of, will He be generous enough to not just give us food, but to take us all the way and redeem us from despair to delight. And so this is their lot. I feel like, again, I just ended with like a Netflix preview of what's coming next. Okay, any other thoughts on this? It's truly a beautiful story. What will happen next? Oh. To be continued. All right, let me pray for us, and then we are going to get our kids. Jesus, you are the true and better, glorious Boaz. And just as we were reminded that you lavish us with riches, with a new identity, you look at us in our helpless state and give us grace, give us mercy, give us so much more than we deserve. And so, Lord, as we consider this story of Boaz's hesed kindness towards Ruth, Lord, would you help us reflect on the hesed love that you've shown us? And would you let that not just affect us intellectually, but would you let that take deep root within our soul so that we might live differently, find freedom in it, find peace and hope in it, so that we might see the world through this lens. Lord, thank you for this story. Would you continue to revive us in our soul as we see the restoration of Ruth? It's in your name we pray. Amen.